Let's make it official. All right. Oh, there was somebody that just came in and I forgot to check them off. Who was it? See, I can't do two things at once. That has nothing to do with being older. I've always been that way. So, oh, it was you. Thank you. All right. Very first person on the list. All right. Thanks for the help. Okay. So today's the day I got to leave at 10. So I'll have to talk really fast. Some of you go, no, I wanted to have 2 hours of class. Nobody wants to have 2 hours of class. All right. All right. Okay, so let's share some stuff and get started. So lecture notes should be in the course documents section, please, please, please. That's where I meant for them to be. And so we'll talk about lecture notes and the questions. And if I tried to update the syllabus, I'm sure I did update the syllabus. Hopefully it feels a little more accurate, sounds a little more like what we wanted it to say. I also changed it to where on the parts where it said 1302, it said 1301. This really is 1301, so I apologize. I did ask my boss if attendance really, really matters, and he said yes. And if you can't attend, that you should still be able to, of course, if you can't attend, you probably aren't here, right? But you should still be able to switch to one of those asynchronous classes where you can just do stuff when you have time to do stuff. So there you go. All right, so sorry, textbook. Mine's blue. Can you see it? Yep, there we go. Ooh, give me liberty. All right, and first chapter, A New World. And of course, this is when Europeans got a little restless or whatever was going on. A lot of stuff was going on in Europe, as we know, and decided it was time to come over to the Americas and see what was going on over here. So maybe they could get some land, find some gold, do whatever it is they wanted to do. And for the different groups, it was different things they wanted to do, which always makes it fun on, when you have July 4th and like, we really need to get back to the reasons that people came over. And it's like, well, there's like a million reasons people came over. Because you'll always hear people say like, well, people came over because they wanted religious liberty. Well, that's why some people came over. Some people came over because they wanted some gold. Some people came over because they wanted some land. Some people probably were just bored. Not too many people, because that was quite a trip and a little expensive for somebody who was just bored. But yeah, okay. All right. And Adam Smith, we always try to bring up like a few people who comment on U.S. history from time to time. Adam Smith is going to be, he was an economist, Scottish, I think, economist. And his idea was capitalism. I mean, yeah. And he also talked about mercantilism. I think he's the one that coined the phrase mercantilism. So he's one of the really 2 or 3 economists that any U.S. historian cares very much about. So Adam Smith, if he said it, it has to be true, right? Discovery of America is one of the 2 greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Well, for us, maybe, yeah, I mean, but there you go. But definitely created an intersection between Europe and the Americas that going to reshape all sorts of stuff for both groups of folks. One, it seems a little less pleasant than the other. And of course, Europeans are always going to think that when they show up that they're improving things. So whatever they did makes things better. But, that is probably true of most cultures. Yeah. The one culture they probably encountered, the Native American groups, probably was the one culture that didn't necessarily feel that way. But also, that's kind of relative and speculative as well. All right, so when Europeans arrived in the Americas, it could have been in ancient times across what people my age were taught was there was a land bridge and people walked across, or maybe some people my age were taught that aliens brought people over. My era was a strange era. But probably crossing the Bering Strait, there was a land bridge potentially, and the larger animals don't fare as well in the Ice Age, that sort of thing. If you're wondering, how do we know stuff like this? Because there's not really recorded history. I guess the true answer is we don't really, but we kind of do. So you look at what what is left in records, so archaeological records, that sort of thing, and then you don't really see recorded history for most of history. So sometimes people drew drawings in caves, that sort of thing. So a lot of this is looking at the physical evidence that's left and making assumptions about these things. And usually when most archaeologists agree, historians go like, oh, it's probably true. So, all right. But all of this is speculative, but it's not as random as it seems. It's not just, a group of historians got together one day and said like, I bet there is a mastodon or something. There's evidence. So, okay. And here we go into names of things that I probably don't say properly, but the good news is probably no one knows how they're said properly. It's probably not true. Tenochtitlan is going to be the capital of the Aztec Empire. And you guys remember talking about the Aztecs back in 6th grade, or whenever you talk about the Aztecs, maybe 10th grade as well. Those guys were really a well-developed society, a little rough at times. What I remember from the old days when I was a kid was being told that they ripped people's hearts out, but ceremonially. I mean, not just because they were angry or anything, but yeah. All right. Somebody's talking about archaeology. That's always good, right? Yeah. Okay. No, it's true. And I think too, the more that we study history and the more we study archaeology and Indiana Jones, the more we learn. I think it's why, sometimes people, younger people, especially not you, but younger than you, think that history, it's old, we shouldn't study it anymore. But the more we study, the more we know. And yeah, I don't know. Now I feel like you're about to get into some weird conspiracy theories. So I'm going to go back to the notes. All right. So we know some about the Aztecs. There's recorded stuff about them. Um, I think what I remember about the Aztecs that I didn't like is they're probably responsible for algebra, something like that. Do we need that really? Concept of zero. They built pyramids, water systems. So really highly developed society with some pretty large cities, that sort of thing. Incan Empire, also large and well developed in the Andes Mountains region. So lots and lots of folks in what's modern day Mexico and modern day Peru. And temples, palaces, roads, bridges. And the reason usually historians like to remind folks of this is a lot of times it's not just Europeans, but for our purposes, Europeans assume that they were really the first civilized group of folks, and before they developed whatever they developed, no one else had it. And that's typically not true. You know that lots of different elements of what we think of as modern civilization develop on different continents, in different tribes or regions, that sort of thing. So just kind of a gentle reminder that some folks south of here had a lot of interesting and sophisticated and modern things going on before Europeans arrived. So there you go. All right, roads, bridges, religion, formal religion. I know, the ripping the hearts out, but just once a year. And Inca's not so much on the heart ripping. Government consistent, um, plentiful supplies of food. So they did some farming, fishing, hunting. Not so much the European style weapons with the metal. And metal weapons, oh, this is where we're going to get into parts where I really fit stereotypes of female history teachers, but the more modern weaponry is not going to be as much a facet of the more developed countries in the Americas. All right, if you're wondering, like in the part of the world that we live in, where there are well-developed societies, the population's probably much sparser in what we think of as North America that's north of Mexico. There's not as many folks because, sometimes the weather was colder, that sort of thing, and it's harder to have consistent food supplies. And consistent food supplies really matter if you're going to have a civilization. They just do. Where I'm from, the great state of Missouri, mound building cultures are pretty trendy. And your book talks, what does your book talk about? Poverty Point, that's right. Because I remember when I first started using this book, all these kids would go like, Poverty Point was a really important place. It's like, no, in the mound building cultures, Cahokia was really the biggest place. It's kind of near the St. Louis, and you can go up there and tour the mounds. You're going like, no, I'm not going to the middle of the country to tour mounds. Come on, people. But Poverty Point sounds much cooler, and I know your book talks about it. So, so for whatever reason, if you use this book, you may not remember Cahokia, which is generally seen as a more important site. You may remember Poverty Point, but either way, it works, right? But mound building cultures, they buried their stuff with the folks who died. So I guess it's sort of similar to what you saw in Egyptian cultures when they buried folks in pyramids, and there were interesting things inside of there. Um, but the mound building cultures have the largest population, which is why we're mentioning them. And the middle of the country, if you're not familiar with the middle of the country, one of the nice things about the middle of the country is there's fairly consistent rain, although dang, this time of year we've got a ton. But in a month and a half, we'll have none. And also food grows pretty naturally in the middle of the country. You know, it's really nice soil. And if you drop a seed, a week later, you have a plant. So that's kind of cool. All right, but the largest cities in northern North America were in Mexico, most likely, Tenochtitlan. There you go. All right, Hopi and Zuni cultures in Pueblo regions, New Mexico, multiple family dwellings, apartments. If you live in Leander, people talk about apartments all the time right now. But the Hopi and Zuni folks build apartments into caves and canyons and cliffs and that sort of thing. And these were the things that from a distance probably looked like gold to Spanish explorers. So when you hear them talking about the 7 cities of Cibola and the things that the gold that they're looking for in the American Southwest, sometimes they did mistake some of these things from a distance as, you know, like gold cliffs. That would have been cool though. These folks are going to construct dams, canals. You've got to, you know, that region of the current United States. You got to make sure you have consistent water. So to have a civilization, you need, you know, consistent water, consistent food. And also the trade routes, especially in New Mexico, are incredibly important and going to be valuable all throughout this era and beyond. And I remember when we studied Southwestern American or US history, they talked about how they typically grew corns, bean, and squash, and they called those the 3 sisters, but that was the fairly consistent food source. And then cotton as well, that they grew to make clothing, that sort of thing. And their villages were referred to as pueblos, which is why later on we called the native groups, I've already called them pueblos today, haven't I? And the book talks about a revolt in 1680. I think it talks about it right around this chapter, yeah. Where the natives really are frustrated by Spanish rule, and it sort of depends on whose history of this that you read. Some people will talk about how they're really frustrated about trade restrictions, about how the Spanish come in and say, like, here are the rules and you're going to follow them. And the folks go like, hey, we were here first, plus there's more of us, and we know you have weapons, but there's still more of us. And some people, some historians think that their greater frustration was about being forced to be Catholic. Some of you are going like, yeah, my grandmother forced me to be Catholic. Not the same thing. Maybe, I don't know. But you know that everywhere the Spanish were, they were insistent that people follow the Catholic religion. And some of that stuff's going to, you know, some of the mission stuff is good. Some of the mission stuff is not so good. And if you have you remember too from your 8th grade history, the God, Gold, and Glory, the 3 reasons that the Spanish came to the New World, and the natives resented all of them. So, a fellow named, nicknamed by the Spanish El Pope, will lead a revolt in 1680 and push the Spanish out. And they eventually will apparently ask them to come back for trading purposes. And when they do come back, it's not so much that the Spanish are in charge anymore, it's that they trade in a mutually beneficial way. We'll talk about that as well. But also a sign, that not all is well between the natives and the Spanish. And you assumed correctly, and you knew from your previous history studies, that a lot of times when somebody comes over and says like, hey, you're our colony now, the people who already live there are not excited about the new relationship. Yeah. And they usually discuss it or fight about it. All right. If you're wondering, did anybody live on what is the current American East Coast? Well, sure. I mean, yeah. So you have pretty sparsely populated groups there as well. And a lot of these groups were maybe affiliated. They had negotiated, they had leagues and confederations, but their languages weren't necessarily from the same families, that kind of thing. So they probably traded, they probably didn't communicate super well. They certainly didn't have written language, but they had symbols, and they developed a kind of a common or mutual way of communication, because you need to if you're going to trade and get along, that sort of thing. But they didn't live close enough that they saw each other all the time. Okay. All right. So these groups in the Southeast, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw, or Chicka. I know when I lived in Missouri, they called them Chickasha, but I don't know that is, I have no idea. And 5 Iroquois people, Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga. And they formed a league of peace, a great league of peace, to make sure that they could coordinate trade, relationships with outside groups. And outside groups would be natives probably in what we would think of as modern day Canada. And if you're wondering, like, did people show up on the coast very often? No. No, it's a long trip. So, people didn't come over from Europe to trade at this point. They're just about to. And this, of course, is the era where that starts. Sorry for the yawn. Oh, goodness. So, unrelated language, their own religious and political beliefs, excuse me, and no sense of shared national, regional, or continental identity. So they didn't see themselves as a nation, like all of them put together, like the United States of Native Americans or something like that. I know that was a dumb thing to say, but they were united. They got together for trade, but they didn't get together for much else. Also, your textbook is going to go through and talk about each individual tribe, you may have already noticed, and they'll talk about how they might be slightly different as far as religious beliefs, what women were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And there's going to be a lot of unusual assumptions made between Europeans and Native Americans because natives, because their cultures are different. They really are, and they develop differently. One of the first things that you'll notice if you look at writing from the time period is they're just fascinated by clothing, and how one group seems to wear substantially less clothing at certain times of the year, at least. And the native clothing is going to be much more practical, and European clothing, well, I know it doesn't probably get warm that often in all of those countries, but for religious reasons as well, women especially are going to wear more clothing in European societies. And also the division of labor is going to be different between women and men in most native groups and European groups. European groups, it's kind of inside the house stuff is what women do, and outside the house stuff is what men do. For native groups, it kind of depends. If they're more hunter-gatherers, then the women probably gather and the men hunt. if they have a combination of agriculture and hunting, then the women probably manage the agriculture and the men probably hunt. Now, because European society, economic society is based more on agriculture, the men really are primarily involved in agriculture, trade, that sort of stuff. So when the European men see the native women growing and harvesting the crops, their assumption is that native men are lazy because hunting is more for sport and it's more of a upper class activity, especially in England. So it's going to lead to all sorts of weird cultural misunderstandings, which people still continue to have, but they had in fairly large ways during this era. And of course, the assumption is always that whatever your group is better or smarter than whatever the group that you're encountering is. So I think there's something about human nature that sort of makes us that way. But all right. So we've already talked about all that stuff. Animism. So religion is going to be dramatically different. There are very few native groups that have the idea of one God or a three-part God that's one God, which is also a little complicated for natives. Natives tend to believe that there are different spirits that occupy different parts of life and different gods that belong to those spirits, or maybe they're spirits and not gods. And they also, one of the fairly common things, especially in North America, is that people don't really own own land, but they use it. And Native Americans see it more as a resource, and Europeans are going to see it more as a commodity. So Europeans are going to derive their wealth from land, and Native Americans or natives are going to devise their, well, they don't get their wealth from their land, but they get their existence. So they think of themselves more as stewards of the land. That doesn't necessarily mean, I think usually this is where younger kids go like, oh, so they're, really good about conservation. Conservation's a fairly modern idea. And, there's not, I don't suppose that Europeans would have seen themselves as wasteful either, but the bigger difference I think that you would see is that natives would see the land and they would live off the land. They probably are not going to have, acres and acres of agriculture, that sort of thing. Whereas Europeans, when they see land, they go like, oh, let's cut down the trees and plant some stuff. Because they grow crops for a living and then they trade that crop for something else that they need. So Europeans are going to think that natives are not using the land properly because they're not doing large crop agriculture. And natives are going to think that Europeans are overusing the land. And then when they get into growing tobacco as a cash crop, then natives are kind of like, that is pretty weird. All right. The Columbian Exchange, it's certainly a term that you want to have some familiarity with. And of course, that's a reference to Christopher Columbus. You've heard of him. He sailed the ocean blue in 1492, Nina Pinta, Santa Maria. But the exchange of items in the Columbian Exchange does, it's not that Columbus brought some stuff on a ship and took other stuff back. Just a reference to the idea that there's a trade or transfer of crops and people and material culture stuff. It's not just plants and animals. It could be like dishes, weapons, cloth. There's different, whatever the material culture is of the group. So, and material cultures, it's your stuff. Like, goodness, I'm looking around my house right now. I don't think I want anybody to know what my material culture looks like right now. But yeah, if an archaeologist were to look at the stuff that you would leave behind, they would end up making some conclusions about how you lived your life. So material culture is the stuff that shows how you lived your life. But also probably the most damaging part of this is disease. Some of you are going like, no, the most damaging part is that people brought their armies over. Yeah, that's probably true as well. But a lot of anthropologists are going to suggest that most of the destruction really is caused by disease, the, the loss of life, because there aren't as many immunities to shared diseases. So when Europeans come over, the diseases that they share, smallpox, influenza, those are the big two. Um, there's not immunities in the Americas built up to that. So, I mean, we're a little more familiar with that because of our last year. Um, tens of millions in 3 years. Are you sure? I don't know. I am not as well versed probably as I need to be on that um, era of history, but certainly we know that many of the conquistadores who came over, their plan was destruction. We know that. And their goal really is to get rid of the power structure so they can replace it. Um, and I am certain that people more learned than I am about about this. I'm pretty good when we get to the Constitution. If you're asking me about the cultures in Mexico and Peru during this time period, my knowledge is fairly basic. Not even going to lie to you. But it's going to, anthropologists are going to suggest that disease is an enormous problem as well. And that's probably even more true in those island nations or island cultures in the Caribbean as well, because there's not going to be very much immunity to anything. Now, there are some indigenous diseases that apparently cause problems to Europeans as well, but they typically aren't fatal. Yeah. All right. Natives have little biological immunity. Oh, here's the list of stuff. Some tribes completely decimated. There we go. Measles, smallpox, influenza, and the disease certainly is an enormous problem. And I realize too that, yeah. All right. Luke is all over this old stuff. And as far as populations, yeah, if you're wondering like how do they decide what the population estimates are, that sort of thing, and that's an anthropologist, archaeologist kind of thing to do. It's by the material culture and of course graves. So they make estimates that way. So if you're wondering what's going on in Europe during this time period that caused people to leave, because as far as immigration and emigration, there's always a push and a pull, right? So usually the push has got to be pretty great during this time period. And there are interesting things going on in Europe during this time period. Europe, some of the land bases are smaller, so the population is more condensed. So the problems sort of affect the different European groups more. I don't know that profoundly is the right word to use here, but because they're closer together, whatever the problem is going to have more of an impact. Like, okay, all right. So Martin Luther, who you might have heard of, who's a priest in Germany, and he is frustrated with the Catholic Church for at least 95 reasons, apparently. So he makes a list of those reasons. Have you ever been frustrated about 95 things and made a list and then tacked it to somebody's door? I have not done that, but Martin Luther did. And his goal really was to get the Catholic Church to consider many of the things he was frustrated about and to get them to make some reforms. His goal was never to start the Lutheran Church, not his goal at all. And that's sort of what ends up happening, but certainly not his goal. And then we end up with Protestants, which gets really confusing because at least with Catholics, there's pretty much one church, and Protestants now there's 8 million. So thank you, Martin Luther. But 95 Theses, the main concern, the biggest one, probably the most famous one, was that of indulgences. And what some priests, probably higher up than priests, bishops, and um, in the higher levels of the church, because I don't know, we all have assumptions and I don't know, biases and that sort of thing. My thought always about the church, and by the church in this era, we always mean the Catholic Church, and probably my thoughts still about the Catholic Church in the modern era. Full disclosure, not Catholic. But my thought about the Catholic Church is when there's corruption in the church, usually most of that corruption in a hierarchical church is probably more at the top because that's where the money and there's more chance for corruption happens to be. Most people are fairly content with their local priest. I know there are things about local priests in the modern era that were not always good. But in general, people are fairly content with the local version of their church. The reason I say this is the indulgence thing was really more of a higher level of the church problem. So let me tell you what it was. I didn't tell you, did I? So Catholic Church, especially in this era, if you wanted to be forgiven, you had to go to the priest or someone and ask for forgiveness, and then they would give you a penance where you would say a certain number of prayers or make an apology or do a good work or a service or something like that. But the higher levels of the church, you could pay an indulgence to either get yourself forgiven of something or perhaps a family member or something like that. So you can write a check for forgiveness. It seems like that would be a very American thing, but no, we did not start that. That was not us. But Martin Luther seemed to think that there was something inappropriate about that. So that was one of the main things that he wanted to change because he saw that as one of the biggest problems in the church. But he also had other theological concerns as well about grace and forgiveness and was the Catholic Church discounting the role of grace in forgiveness, that sort of thing. Now, if you read very much about Martin Luther, which I probably have read more about Martin Luther than I have some of the other things we're going to talk about today. But Martin Luther, not exactly a big fan of democracy or, equality, that sort of thing. He definitely did not think that all people were equal. He definitely did not think that everyone should have an equal voice in their church. And he thought that letting the common people have a voice in something was a terrible idea. So he would not have been in favor of revolution. He would not have been in favor of democracy. He's an upper class dude and he behaves in an upper class dude sort of way. But his concerns about theology don't really transfer to politics or day-to-day society is what I'm trying to say. So, all right. But he is not successful in getting the church to make changes. What ends up happening is the group that follows his ideas pulls away from the church and they form what becomes the Lutheran Church. So this is a split in the church. You'll see a similar split in England with it's Henry VIII, right? Henry VIII. That's the dude that had a lot of wives. Yeah, and wanted to divorce them. And the Catholic Church said no. And so he got really spiritual and said, oh, the Catholic Church is wrong, and started his own church so he could get divorced. Yay. But so Lutheran Church, at least it starts with, at least a kind of a more noble start than the Church of England, which I guess our version of the Church of England is, theirs is Anglican, ours is Episcopal. And this also, we'll pause here for a moment to talk about Christianity. If you're wondering, is it okay for us to talk about Christianity in a history class? Of course it is. It's a historical thing. And in US history, Christianity matters quite a bit. It's going to lead to lots of reform. It's going to lead to people wanting to have a separation of church and state. And so in some instances to protect the church, in some instances to protect the state. So Christianity, it's really probably helpful for you to have a basic understanding of Christianity. And I don't necessarily mean a theological understanding, because yeah, that would take a long time and that one may get us a little off track. But here is my suggestion for you to have a basic understanding of Christianity. You ready? Okay. It's not, if you are like, if you're a minister, you're not going to like my basic discussion of Christianity, but for our historical purposes and understanding as well that not everybody comes into this class with a basic understanding of Christianity, here we go. Okay, there are two major groups within Christianity: Catholics and not Catholics. That's it. So the Catholics follow the Pope. Okay, so when Catholics are upset at the church, it is possible that they may appeal to the Pope about something. Now, Protestants, they really don't care so much about the Pope. The reason I bring this up is a lot of times there'll be some misunderstanding about church and state. And I always have a student that will write about how the English settlers were mad at the Pope. The English settlers probably could care less about the Pope. Just trust me on this, because they're part of that not Catholic group. So we have Catholics who they've got a priest and the priest doesn't get married, and they have a pope and they go to confession, that sort of thing. And then you have Protestants who are the not Catholics. And Protestants are, no offense, they're just a big mess. Now, if I were to group myself within a group here, I would group myself in the Protestant group that's a mess. And Protestants are a mess because first you have like a group of Protestants that essentially become Lutherans. But then you have a group of Protestants in England that become Anglicans. And then you'll have some Baptists and Anabaptists, and then there are people who move away from the Lutheran Church and become Presbyterians, maybe. And then in the United States, there'll be some Baptists, and some of them think slavery is a good idea, and some of them think slavery is a bad idea. So you'll have Southern Baptists, and then Lutherans will do the same thing, and they'll have different synods. So by the time you are done, there are so many different Protestant churches that there's not the Protestant church. So there is the Catholic Church, and everybody who's Catholic knows they're Catholic. People who are Protestant don't necessarily know they're Protestant. They're just not Catholic. It's very confusing, sort of. But all of these people, probably almost all of these people, share the idea that there's a God, and there's Jesus, and there's the Holy Spirit. So like a three-part God. And part of their scriptures are shared by Jews. So at least, the first 5 books of the Bible are kind of in common with the Pentateuch, the Jewish scripture. So this is part of why historically Judaism and Christianity are kind of linked, and the United States in the modern era tends to favor Israel over not Israel in the Middle East. That's way too much. But for your purposes, Christians, which is almost all of the United States in our class, okay, not in the modern era, but in our class. So almost everybody in the United States during the time that we're studying in our class is Christian, almost everybody. And they're either Protestant or Catholic, and they're more likely to be Protestant unless they're in the Southwest, because that's where Spain was, and Spain is Catholic. All right, and Catholics, they like the Pope, and they have a priest, and they go to Mass, and Protestants do all kinds of other stuff, but they don't have a Pope. I don't know if that made it any better, but you have 2 big groups, Catholics not Catholics, and we call not Catholics Protestants, but nobody goes to the Protestant church. Okay, that probably didn't help at all, but we'll probably take that up again later because it's going to come up. All right. Because for whatever reason, fairly quickly in US history, the United States becomes a fairly anti-Catholic place, except where you live, where this part of the country has never really been anti-Catholic because it used to be Mexico, which used to be Spain, which used to not be Spain. But then, the Spanish showed up with Catholic priests. So this part of the country doesn't mind Catholics, but a lot of the rest of the country for most of our history is pretty anti-Catholic. Oh my gosh. We've gotten into so many things in the first chapter. Let's go back to this. Sorry. Okay. This does matter. Okay. So your document question, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, I was thinking we talked about it on Monday, but tomorrow will be the day. We'll talk more about the document question tomorrow, but you're going to maybe like this De las Casas fellow, maybe not. I don't know. You don't have to like him, but he's a priest, and he comes over during the colonial period, Spanish colonial period in the Americas. And you may have studied Treaty of Tordesillas. Did you study that back in the day when you were kids? Where you've got Portugal and Spain that both want to colonize, and Portugal is the nation that makes all the nice like the astrolabe and the compass and that sort of stuff. So they're really good at the nautical equipment. Yeah, navigation stuff. Yeah. And Spain, they're right next door. So they're going to either get it or copy it or that sort of thing. And so they're really exploring the world really before England is. And both of these nations are Catholic. And they're frustrated because they're fighting with each other over who gets what territory. So the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is 1494, when they make this treaty, both the nations go to the Pope, because he's their controlling spiritual authority, because he's the head of the Catholic Church, and they say like, "Hey, Pope, we both want to explore. We both want land. How do we decide?" This, of course, is not exactly what they said, but how do we decide who gets what land? So he just got a map and drew a line and said, "You get the stuff that's east and you get the stuff that's west." So Spain got the western stuff in South America and in Mexico, and Portugal got the eastern stuff, which really turns out to be Brazil and some islands off the coast. But Brazil's really big, so you don't have to feel sad for them. So they split at least the southern part of the New World in that way. And some people are starting to be critical in early 1500s about how these supposed Christian conquistadores are treating the natives in the lands they're exploring. And if your idea is that you're going to be pursuing God, gold, and glory in that order, killing folks really is probably not the best way to pursue God. Now, if you read a lot of the stories, and part of the reason you have the stories is because of Las Casas and some other folks recorded some of the things that they heard and some of the things that they saw as well. But if you read some of the stories, what you'll see is before they killed people, they did at least ask them to convert. And part of the reason that they have the plazas and the porticos near the churches is they thought that the natives were too unclean to actually come in the church, but they would have them in the plaza and maybe preach to them from the balcony, that sort of stuff. And that's a fairly mild insult compared to killing people or, yeah. But some of the priests also, some of the other folks, but some of the priests were starting to be critical of this because they didn't see this as the best way to carry out God's will toward the natives. So Las Casas is going to write to the King of Spain and to the Pope and say, look, we have got to stop doing these cruel things because it doesn't forward the will of God, or it's not a good way to proselytize. We're not converting people, we're stealing their stuff and killing them. And so the golden glory part has taken precedence over the God part. So one of the things that's happening as well is that the conquistadores are enslaving some of the natives, and they're setting up encomienda systems where people have to work on where they worked before, but now they have to give a certain percentage to the conquistador, or to the head landowner, the encomendero, and they have to pay that tribute to them. So they're not exactly slaves, but they're kind of like slaves. And in some instances, they are directly enslaving some of the natives. So Las Casas is going to argue that they should not be enslaved. Now, in the initial part of his argument, the part that's super controversial, as you might imagine, he says we really should not enslave natives because they're very much like Europeans. They look like Europeans, they have the ability to learn like Europeans, they have a really spiritual sense about them. So if we're going to enslave people, we really need to enslave people from Africa. That's a much more acceptable thing to do. I know in the modern era you're going like, he did not say that. He did say that. He wrote it down. We have proof of it. And then later, as he continues to serve, and they do begin to enslave more and more folks from Africa and bring them to the New World, he'll also write, I was wrong about that as well. We should not enslave anyone. So he gets to that conclusion far sooner than most people who are not enslaved come to that conclusion, and will certainly be part of that movement that pushes the Catholic Church to say that slavery is a sin. And they'll come to that conclusion before, in general, larger Protestant groups come to that conclusion, but not as early as people who are enslaved come to that conclusion. So Las Casas is going to write extensively about the treatment of natives and also about the treatment of slaves eventually. And one of the books that eventually is put together, and he wrote a lot of, what's the word that I'm looking for? A lot of the incidents or stories that he either observed in his 50 years in the Americas, or heard from other priests, or just heard about. He combined those in a volume of letters and sent those to the king and to the Pope. And then he thought, you know what, that's so big, they're not going to read it. So he sent a shorter version to them, which is put together as a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is what the excerpt that I'm sharing with you is from. And you could read a whole lot of that. One of the things that you would notice is it becomes really, really repetitive. And part of the reason it becomes repetitive is because it happened a lot. And he's also condensing 50 years of stuff into a short account. So it seems, fairly condensed and repetitive, which is going to be one of the complaints about the book as well. I won't tell you more about that because we're going to talk quite a bit about that tomorrow. But Las Casas is from Spain, thinks that enslaving natives and Africans later on is detrimental to the reputation of Christianity and to the King of Spain. He really thinks, oh gosh, typos, look at that. Who writes this stuff? I know it was me, by the way. Writes to the King of Spain to persuade him that if he changes how the natives and Africans are treated, then he will be seen as a better Christian. He'll be seen by history in a better way, that sort of thing. But the king's really not concerned because he's making so much money from this trade overseas, lots and lots of profits. So, and it also encourages the development of something called the Black Legend, which is part of the reason that people in what becomes the United States are strongly anti-Catholic. And of course, England is going to be strongly anti-Catholic because they've never had any of the problems that the Spanish and other Catholic nations have had when they colonized. They didn't commit any of these atrocities. Probably not it, but because they were in competition with these Catholic nations for the land, they at least wanted to portray themselves as more noble. And, probably, well, I don't even want to speculate about any more stuff. So, Black legend. Discussion using examples from De las Casas and other writings from the era to accuse the Catholic Church and Catholic nations of atrocities, improprieties toward natives during colonization and exploration. And of course, it's primarily advanced by the British to denigrate the Spanish conquistadores, also kept journals that showed similar atrocities and improprieties that further illustrated the Black legend. If you're wanting to do English, especially plantation owners later on, keep journals that document their atrocities. Absolutely, they do, because they didn't see them as atrocities. That's why they write this stuff down. They're just recording what's going on. To them, it's not embarrassing or wrong or anything like that. They're just making a record of what they're doing because they think that record will be important because they're wealthy people. So. All right. French exploration in the New World. And I think this is the thing that's probably talked about the least in this textbook, and probably the thing that we cover the least when we have US history classes, because it's Canada. Yeah, do we care about Canada? No, of course we care. We do care a little about Canada, but usually in our courses, we don't cover Canada as much. So apologies to Canada and the French. French exploration of the New World. And it's also generally seen as more positive by the people who received the French exploration because they didn't bring troops. They'd had some troops, but they didn't bring the large numbers of troops that you see, especially with the Spanish in the initial part of their colonization, and with the English in the later part of their colonization. The French, just fewer folks. So you got fewer folks, fewer families, so they're not taking over as much land, they're not settling in to farm. They're really there to explore and to trade. And it's mostly dudes, and they also bring priests. This is more of a group of, the priests are Catholic, but they are much less likely to insist that the natives become more like them. They're much more likely, the French are more likely to assimilate. And I would suggest that it's probably because their numbers are smaller. I think the French were also quite proud of their own culture and heritage and thought it was better than everybody else's. It's just if you're vastly outnumbered and don't have as many weapons, you're probably not going to come in and say, like, do what we say and be like us. So French primarily in modern day Canada. I'm looking for a northwest passage across to get to, we never even talked about this. Everybody wanted to get to Asia and India for trading purposes, and they didn't realize that the land mass that they were trying to go through was nearly as big as it was. So everybody thought they could find a way around it or through it, that sort of thing. They didn't have satellites, so they really didn't have good maps back then. They're going to vastly improve their maps because of this time period. French, primarily modern day Canada, looking for the Northwest Passage. And you'll also see them down the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. I feel like that's some old song from one of those cartoons we used to watch. But that's also why if you're near the Mississippi River, like if being from Missouri, if you're in the east part of Missouri, there are lots of French names of towns and French Catholic cathedrals, that sort of thing. And of course, Louisiana feels fairly French, and New Orleans has some fairly French things about it. So the French, all the way from Canada down to Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River, primarily men, more interested in trade than farming. They brought priests to convert the natives. French tended to be well accepted by natives because they're smaller in number. They're less insistent on assimilation and less threatening to the tribes. They're more likely to assimilate into the native culture because it's a lot of dudes, they'll marry native women, and you see that, fairly commonly, rather than insisting that the natives adopt French culture and language the way that the Spanish did. Um, and even in their desire to convert natives, they are much less insistent, threatening. They're not going to, say, convert before we kill you, that sort of thing. They're much less demanding about that. So, all right. Natives tend to see trade with the French as more fair and equitable, which it may or may not have been. And then we don't talk about the Dutch at all. Now, because it's almost time to go today, I apologize. I know it's not a full length of class, but I won't go to the doctor every day, I promise. Oh, gosh, who could afford that anyway? We got to stop here. Tomorrow we'll talk much more about the document question. So be ready for that. And hopefully, if you guys have questions, that you'll bring those with you as well. So if you haven't read the first chapter, you may want to try to do that before class tomorrow. And we'll probably talk as much as we can about the document question and chapter 1 question for unit 1. All right, so before we stop the recording and before I go, which I have to do in like a minute and a half, do you guys have any questions? Sorry to have to go so soon. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.